What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook and welcome back to another Crafter Workshop video. In this week's video, I'm going to show you how I installed this vinyl plank flooring, which has really transformed this front space. Super easy to install using very basic tools. And I got all of this flooring and most of the tools I used in this video from Lowe's Home Improvement, who is the sponsor of this week's video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the project.
The first step with any flooring project is to prep your space, and luckily for me, I was installing this flooring on an existing concrete slab, so I didn't have anything to remove other than just vacuuming up any dust or debris. I did also double check the moisture levels and made sure there weren't any large divots in the slab before installing the flooring. Now you might be removing carpet or even laying this flooring over something like sheet vinyl, and if you want some tips on removing carpet, check out my laminate flooring video where I went into a lot more detail on that process. I'll have a link to that video in the cards as well as the video description below. Also, I obviously had no trim in this space since it was new construction, but you might also want to consider removing your baseboards if you want to avoid using quarter round or shoe molding. Alright, with the prep out of the way, we could start figuring out the layout of the flooring. And we're going to be running this flooring throughout this front photo wall area into the office in this space, and we had multiple walls to deal with. So we took measurements from the photo wall to the outside wall of the office, as well as from the photo wall to the inside wall of the office. We then measured the face of the vinyl plank flooring we were installing, which ended up being right about 5 7/8 of an inch wide, and then I could do some quick math. So first I divided the distances I measured by the width of the planks, and I also made sure to subtract the 1/4 inch expansion gap that's needed on each side of the flooring from the overall distances first. And this ended up at 37.1 planks between the photo wall and inside office wall, and this meant I'd have an extremely small strip left from my last row at that wall. So next I tried subtracting 2 inches from each of the measurements, which would be the measurement if I ripped 2 inches off the first row of flooring, and this worked out a lot better, leaving us with at least half a plank at both walls. So with that worked out, we could move on to getting the first row installed. First, we looked through the flooring to see if there was any discernible group of patterns in each box, but this flooring did a really great job of making the patterns look random by staggering the patterns across the boards at different intervals. We picked a group of boards to make up our first row, and then we could get them cut to width. And so we first tried scoring and snapping the flooring, which is a process I've seen in other vinyl plank flooring installation videos, but evidently this specific flooring isn't really designed for snapping, as it did not go well. So no biggie, as we had plenty of other power tools to choose from for this task. To make a rip cut with the jigsaw, I marked a line with my speed square and then just followed that line with the jigsaw. And one tip here, you'll probably want to grab a finer tooth blade for cutting this flooring, as it'll leave you with a cleaner cut than the blade that your jigsaw likely came with. Also, make sure you're cutting off the side of the board with the tongue, as you'll need the groove to be able to fit the next row. Now the jigsaw did work great for this, but since we had a table saw available, we moved to that for ripping the rest of the boards for the first row to width. As I mentioned earlier, these floors need a minimum expansion gap of 1/4 inch, and to help maintain that gap, there are spacer kits available, but these tend to kind of be a pain to work with, as they just kind of flop over as soon as you butt the flooring up against them. So instead of using these spacers, we ripped some small strips of the flooring offcuts at the table saw, and then cut them into short lengths at the miter saw, and then we could use those as our spacers. And since they butt right up against the bottom plate of the wall, they're super secure, and as long as they're spaced below your drywall to remove them after installing the flooring, they make for a pretty great spacer option. Alright, so let's finally get that first row laid down. Now my buddy Justin and I built this wall we were starting this flooring on in a previous video in this series, so we knew it was dead straight, but you'll want to check whether your wall is straight before using it as a reference line for your first row. If it's not straight, you can snap a chalk line and use that as your reference line. To start the first row, I added a few spacers along the wall, as well as another spacer at the left end of the board, and then put the board in place. To connect the second board to the first board, I lifted the second board at an angle and slid the tongue into the groove, then lowered the board to lock it into place. I also made sure the boards were aligned, and I placed one of the spacers directly behind each joint just to make sure they stayed flush. The last board in the first row needed to be cut to length, so I marked where I needed to cut by flipping the board around, leaving the 1/4 inch expansion gap at the end against the wall, and then marking a line even with the face of the previous board. And this is a whole lot easier than trying to measure, and just keeps you from getting numbers mixed up and cutting your boards to the wrong length. To cut the board to length, we used the miter saw here, but as I'll show you in this video, there are a plethora of options for cutting this flooring. With the board cut to length, I could lock it into place, and then the first row was complete. Next, we could start laying out the second row, and since we started the first row with a full-length board, we knew we needed to cut the first board in the second row to stagger the seams between the first and second rows. To determine the length of the first board, we added a piece that would represent the second board in the row, making sure the seams were staggered at least 8 inches, and then measured the length we'd need. I marked the length on the board and then drew a square line across the face of the board using my speed square. To cut this board to length, I pulled out an inexpensive handsaw, and since this flooring is basically just plastic, it cuts really easily, and using hand tools is always super satisfying. For the second row, we decided to dry fit the entire row and then install it all at once, so we needed to finish laying out the row first. The last board in the row needed to be notched around this concrete wall, but first there was some old sealant that needed to be removed from the floor, and I used this new Dremel Multimax 50 from Lowe's for this, and it made really quick work of it. And you'll see me using this Multimax a ton during this project, and it was incredibly useful, with tons of different attachment options for cutting, sanding, grinding, and more. I'd highly recommend picking one up if you're going to tackle a project like this, and I'll have a link to the Multimax in the video description below in case you're interested. To mark the notch, I first cut the board to length and then marked out where I needed to cut the notch, making sure to factor in the expansion gap. I transferred the lines using my speed square and then cut the notch with the Multimax using this half circle shaped blade, which I find is easier to cut in a straight line. After cutting the notch, I could test fit the board and it fit great. As I mentioned, we installed the entire second row in one go, so we first locked all of the ends of the boards together and then lifted the entire row, locking the entire long edge in place all at once. To make sure the joint seated properly, we used scraps of the flooring as tapping blocks, working our way down the row and making sure the joint was fully seated. And the main reason for adding the entire second row at once was to give the flooring a little bit more surface area and weight, which would just make the following rows a lot easier to install. And on the third row and throughout the rest of the flooring install, we added each board individually. We started the third row with the offcut of the last board from the second row, tapping it into place to make sure it locked in, then we could continue working down the row. When fitting the boards that had to lock in on their end and along their edge, we would first lock in the end, then lift up on the board to allow the edge to lock in. Once again, we used an offcut as a tapping block, lifting the board while tapping it into place, and you'll know when the board is totally locked in, as it'll lay flat rather than being lifted off the floor slightly. To cut the last board in the third row to length, I once again used the Multimax, which again made quick work of this process. To make sure the joint in the last board was tight, I used this flooring pull bar, which just gives you an easy way to tap the board into place when you can't get to the end of the board with your hammer or mallet. And at this point, it was just rinse and repeat until we got to the next doorway. And as you can see, having 2 people really sped up this process, as Justin could work on the following row while I finished up the previous row. And we installed all of this flooring in one day, which is a lot quicker than I could have done by myself. Once we got to the doorway, we needed to notch the piece to fit beneath the door jamb. And speaking of the jamb, we didn't need to cut the right side of this jamb to height, but we did need to do that on the left side of the door, which I'll show a little bit later. After notching the board with the jigsaw, we locked it into place and then just tapped it until it was flush with the rest of the flooring. Before moving on, we marked a line across the transition area of the doorway so that we knew where we needed to start each board. We could just continue adding more rows until we got to the other jamb, which did need to be trimmed, so that the flooring could fit underneath it. And we also added this piece of trim just to illustrate the process if your doorway already has trim installed, which it probably does. So I swapped over to a flush cut blade on the Multimax, and then using a scrap piece of flooring as a spacer, I undercut the jamb and trim. I also marked a line where the transition strip would end and made sure not to cut past that line on the jamb, and then I switched positions to finish undercutting the trim. And since the jamb wasn't cut all the way through, I came back with a chisel to pop out that little leftover piece. And as you can see, I was left with a pretty much perfect fit with just enough clearance for the flooring. So after notching the piece, we could drop it into place, and it fit great. Now, as you might have noticed, even with all of our measurements and calculations, we still somehow ended up with basically a full row at the outside office wall. Now, I think this flooring was ever so slightly wider than we measured, and that kind of 1/32 of an inch or maybe 1/16 of an inch error multiplied with each row of flooring. So it wasn't a big deal, it just meant we needed to notch these boards slightly to be able to use the pull bar to get them seated. We notched the boards with the jigsaw and then installed them by dropping them into place, lifting them slightly, and then using the pull bar to pop the joints into place. And we finished out that row, and then we could move into the office area. So we needed to notch the board in the doorway in the office on both ends, and I decided to do this with the handsaw just for a change of pace. And once again, it cut easily, although it did get a little bit floppy when ripping that last bit of the notch. After dropping that piece into place, we could measure for the first row in the office, which ended up at about 1.5 inches. And we ripped this first row to width of the table saw and then added it in the office, making sure to add our spacers before adding that first row. And the office was super simple with no obstructions to work around, so we just kept adding rows until we got to the second to last row where we needed to use the pull bar to lock it into place. The very last row was another small strip, but it locked into place easily enough with the pull bar along with a little bit of persuasion with a hammer. And getting that last piece snapped into place was super satisfying. The last bit of flooring to add was in this little hallway between the office and the front windows, and we ended up having the exact number of boards left in the box we'd already opened, so we just cut them all to the same length rather than trying to use the boards as efficiently as possible, since the leftover pieces wouldn't have really been very useful. So with that, the flooring was finished, so we could move on to getting the office door installed and then adding the trim. And if you've been following along with my shop build series, I'll have a dedicated video on the door installation and the installation of the rest of the trim in the office and shop area in a few weeks, but let's go ahead and cover the baseboards in this video. We used a combination of 1x4 primed pine and radiata pine for the baseboards, and used both brad nails and finish nails in lengths of at least 2 inches to attach the baseboards. That said, you could certainly use small trim head screws if you don't have a nail gun, as you'll need to fill the nail holes anyway prior to painting. Also, make sure to hit the studs whether you're using nails or screws, as otherwise the trim won't be attached securely. On the second board, you can see that we needed to scribe the board due to the extreme bow in the floor. To do this, Justin put a pencil on top of a shim and just slid it along the floor, transferring the hump in the floor to the baseboard. I could then cut along that line with the jigsaw. After cutting the scribed section, I could fit the baseboard, and it looked great, so I nailed it into place. On the next board, we could just flex the board into place to follow the curve of the floor, and once again, it was super helpful having a second set of hands here. After finishing up the baseboard in the office, we could move outside. And all of the cuts up until this point have just been simple 90-degree cuts, but here we ran into our first miter. To measure for the mitered end, Justin placed a scrap piece of baseboard against the perpendicular wall and measured to that board, which represented the distance from the long point of the miter to the door trim. And he snuck up on the fit at the miter saw, and then, once the fit was nice and snug, we could get the baseboards attached. Another tip I picked up here was to add some wood glue to the mitered corner, as it'll help to hold the corner together over time. Also, once the miter was fit tightly, Justin would add a few brad nails into the miter to hold it in place before attaching the baseboards to the wall. After that, we could just continue working our way around the room, around the rest of the photo wall area, until we got to this brick wall, which again needed to be scribed. This time, the back side of the baseboard needed to be cut away, and the Multimax again made really quick work of this task. To attach the trim to the brick, we used a hammer drill to drill a hole through the baseboard into the brick, and then added string trimmer cord to the holes. And the trimmer cord provides a filler material in the hole for the screw to grab onto, and we used this little trick a ton during this whole build. Speaking of which, next we needed to attach the transition between the front door and the flooring, which uses nails as fasteners. So we drilled holes into the concrete floor, added more trimmer cord, and then hammered in the nails, and once again, the cord provided something for the nail to grab onto, and the transition was extremely secure after adding the nails. And we repeated this same process at the other doorway leading into the shop off camera. The last bit of trim to attach was this cord around where the flooring met this aluminum window front, and Lowe's sells perfectly matching cord around, but it wouldn't have arrived in time for this project, so we just found another cord around that matched closely and was in stock. To attach the trim, I once again used trim screws, pre-drilling holes through the cord around into the aluminum, and on the first screw, I ended up using too small of a bit to pre-drill and actually broke the screw. And luckily it had already grabbed onto the aluminum, but don't keep driving the screw if it's straining too much. And with that, all of the baseboard and trim was installed, so we could call this flooring project finished.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I just love the way this flooring has changed the way this space looks. It was extremely simple to install. Highly recommend this vinyl flooring if you've got a space where regular traditional hardwood flooring wouldn't work for you, like over concrete in a really wet area, anything like that. I think this vinyl is a great choice. So thanks again to Lowe's for sponsoring this week's video. If you want to see more about the tools and materials I used on this project, check out the links in the video description below. Also, if this is your first time to the channel, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that little notification bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. All right, thanks again for watching, everybody, and until next time, happy building.